Curiosity Club of 2013, and if my counting is correct, and I'm not totally sure it is, but Matt, it will be our 60th speaker, which is crazy. But anyways, hello and welcome to tonight's meeting of the Hand-Eye Supply Curiosity Club. We're your host this evening. I'm Tobias Berblinger, and this is Will Colma. And we also have Janita Cardenas doing video for us tonight. Thank you. So together we have a number of curious and exciting topics to share with you.
As attendees of the Hand-Eye Supply Curiosity Club, you are all now members, provided you adhere to our philosophy. Ex curiositas scientia. We pledge to learn without prejudice in pursuit of our mutual goal, perpetual noviceship. We admit that it is impossible to know everything about anything, and thus we remain perpetually curious and perpetually novice. This is our flag and our mascot, Franklin. The lightning bolt represents the receipt of knowledge, the enlightenment of illumination, the resonance of truths understood. It awakens and excites us and makes us hungry for more.
And now let's give a warm Curiosity Club welcome to Matt Reed of Beekeeping.
Hello everyone, it's great to see all of you here. I've never been here and this place is awesome. They give me beer and quite a crowd. Before I get going, I figure I should give you an idea of who I am and why I'm here talking to you. I want to let everyone online know there's a man with a parrot on his shoulder here, and everyone has a beer in hand. So this is awesome, and so you should get one too, and a parrot. So I think all of us have a story about what brings us into beekeeping. It's not a hobby that you just, most of the time, people don't just decide one day I'm going to be a beekeeper. Something leads you to want to have a box of thousands of stinging insects on your property or your friend's property. And so I have one of those stories. And so for me, it's as if honeybees choose their keepers quite often. I talk to beekeepers all over the country as I speak, and I go to trade shows, and I learn about their stories. And so I have one of those stories. And I was living off of Hawthorne, about Hawthorne and 30th in an apartment. And I walked into my kitchen and I noticed a honeybee laying on the windowsill. And I'm the guy that saves all of the unlovable creatures of the world, the spiders and other creatures that most other people would smash or flush down the toilet. And so I decided to save this honeybee. And so I knew enough to know that they are insects, they sting, they probably eat honey, they live in colonies. And so I grabbed this plate, I warmed it up, I pushed the honeybee onto the plate, and then I gave her some honey. And I watched in amazement as she started running towards the honey and drinking and gaining energy and cleaning her wings, and I knew she wanted to leave. So I took her out to the front porch, and then I watched as she spiraled off into the sky. And I was very proud, and I told my wife, and she thought I was crazy. And later on, she was leaving for work, and there were dozens of bees flying into our screen door at our front door of our apartment. Because that bee had gone and told her friends that Matt's house is great, and he will give you honey. And so that's when I was hooked. And about a month later, I had my first beehive, and then that entire winter, I began researching and building my own hives, similar to these, but far more rudimentary. And I started learning about the philosophies out there in beekeeping. And I learned beekeeping, it's really tied to our agriculture. And it's very antiquated. It hasn't changed a lot since the 1850s or so, when there was a certain hive was invented. And so the same type of practices used in our agriculture when it comes to pesticides and medicating things, it's also applied to honeybees. And so this startled me and made me wonder, why do we have to do this? Couldn't we keep bees more naturally? Just like many Portlanders and other sustainably minded folks are trying to farm and garden organically, I wanted to try and do that myself with my beekeeping. So I learned about these alternative hives, I guess you could call them. We're going to talk about them in more detail in a bit here. But as I was building them, people started asking me if they could buy them. And I thought these people were nuts. I wondered why they would want to buy these things I was kind of pounding together in my garage. I'd never built anything in my life. But I figured if these people are asking, there's got to be more people out there that want them. And so I built an online store, and now this is all I do. Really since 2008, I have been selling beehives for a living. And so I'm happy I get to do this. I think I used to do IT, and IT was fun, but not like beekeeping is for me. This is my love. So as I go through this, try and hold your questions until about 6:30, where I'll start taking questions. Normally my classes are about 3 hours, so I'm going to really be going quickly through a few topics here, and then I think you guys are going to have a lot of interesting questions, and I'm sure the other people have the same ones. So as I was talking about agriculture and beekeeping, I figured I'd show an image of what beekeeping looks like today. Most of the hives in the United States are managed by a number of what are called commercial beekeepers. These are the guys that have tens of thousands of hives in their apiary, as it's called. And they make their living either selling honey, or most of them make their money pollinating. And a lot of people don't realize this, that most of the revenue for beekeepers throughout the United States comes from pollination contracts. And that's where they take their bees out to a field for a particular crop, in this case almonds in California, and they get paid per hive to have their bees there to do pollination. And so the interesting thing about it is that this is monoculture. This is one type of flower planted for many, many miles. And so there's really nothing else for the bees locally to forage on. And there's something like 4,000, 6,000 types of native bee in North America. But when there's nothing for them to eat, they can't survive. So we must bring in honeybees to pollinate those plants, because otherwise it's just this vast wasteland, and nothing can survive there. And so this is the largest migration of beekeepers in the world. They come from New York and Florida and Texas to this really like the gold mine of beekeeping. They take them all to Northern California in February around Valentine's Day. And it takes something like 1.5 million colonies to pollinate the almonds in California. And there's only 2.5 million colonies in the United States. So more than half of our bees are taken to one location every spring, every February, to spread their diseases to each other, spread their pests, and then take them all back to where they came from and then spread them to their friends nearby. And so it's not an ideal situation. Most of these commercial beekeepers are not happy about what they have to do, but this is how they make a living. They've been doing this for generations. And also, we, as consumers, we wouldn't have the produce that we enjoy if it wasn't for these guys who have relatively thankless jobs. And few people out there know that every third bite of food they eat is thanks to these bees and these beekeepers that are moving them all over the country. But it's due to the losses of honeybees. I'm sure some of you out there have heard of this colony collapse disorder thing that started in 2006. It's since these losses that many people have been getting into beekeeping, and backyard beekeeping is booming as people start their own hives in their backyard, because they want to do their part. They want to try and help out pollinators in one way or another. People are also planting pollinator-friendly gardens. They're thinking more about what they could put in their yard that's going to attract and feed these creatures that really we depend on as humans. And so I think while the losses are horrible, it's also kind of a good thing, because it's opening up people's eyes. It's helping them to see that these creatures we depend on almost entirely for the ability to eat and enjoy life as we know it. And so it's good for the world, I think, that people are starting to see this. So this is some of my hives in my apiary. I live in Oak Grove, Milwaukee area. Do I have any other fellow Oak Grovers out there? None of you? All right. So this is actually a neighborhood. It looks like I'm out in the country or something, but now there's this giant house right behind, you can see my fence there. There's this huge McMansion sort of thing right in the way. And so I've got anywhere between 10 and 20 hives in my backyard at any given time. And throughout all of my yards, all my bee yards, as we call them, I've got usually over 30 hives. And about half of them are this style here, this French hive. This is called a III Hive. I'm going to be talking about it in more detail. And then about the other half are this long one over here called a Kenyan top bar hive. This one on the left is a Kenyan top bar hive. This one with a strap around it is a III Hive. There's a few others in there. The interesting one for me is this tree stump looking thing. This was a willow tree in my backyard. And when I really got into beekeeping, I just moved into this home. I just put out a bunch of beehives, and I had this willow tree that was going to fall on my house. It was rotten and dying, and I was going to get it cut down. So the arborist came out, and he was chopping limbs off of this tree, and they noticed there was a colony inside my willow tree on the property I'd purchased. And so they left this phallic-looking willow tree sticking up out of my yard. My neighbors all wondered what I was doing and why I left it there without any branches or limbs. And I left her there for months until we had the courage or enough alcohol to cut it down. And so we aimed it at some mulch in the yard so that hopefully it would be cushioned a little bit. And my wife's crazy friend had a chainsaw, and he came out, chopped it down, and then we started chopping through this tree. It's huge, and we don't know exactly where the colony is. And so we continued chopping through it until we thought we were safe, and then we took a truck and dragged it over here, and we had a natural honeybee colony as in a cavity they would choose to live in. And so a lot of people don't realize that honeybees are all over the place. Portland, there are feral colonies. That is, this is honeybees that are not managed by a beekeeper. They're in walls, they're in trees, they're in mailboxes, they're in any sort of dry, safe cavity that they can find. And we go about our lives really unaware that this is happening all around us. But as a beekeeper, I get to see these feral colonies every day during the spring and summer, because I get hundreds and hundreds of phone calls from homeowners freaking out because they've got this colony that has now moved into their wall. It's found this perfect place to live, but they didn't ask the homeowner first. And so then I get to go out and remove it. So it's really been interesting for me over the years to see where honeybees choose to live and also educate the public on what they are. Because when they see a swarm of bees, have any of you seen a swarm, like a big clump of bees hanging somewhere? A number of you out there have. It's a pretty intimidating sight for the uneducated, because it could be 10, 20, 30,000 bees hanging in this giant clump. It's pretty scary looking, but it's a time when they're really the most docile. And I have a video at the end I'm going to try and show here of what they look like and how we transfer them into a hive. This is another one of my yards. These little boxes I have there, those are actually swarms that I caught throughout the city of Portland. So I go out with these boxes in the back of my car, my Volvo. If you were to look at my taillights, you see dozens of bees in my taillights because they get out and fly all over my car. But I catch them in these little boxes, and then I take them to my bee yards and I let them grow, and then I'll either use them in my own apiary or I'll sell them to our customers. My philosophy, forgot to go over in more detail. My philosophy on beekeeping is very hands-off. I try not to disturb my bees very much. I think that they've been doing this for millions of years. I've only been doing this for a few years, so they probably are a little bit better at it than I am. And so I only intervene when I really feel I need to. And I try and learn that by monitoring the exterior of the hive. If the hive has a window, I can generally look in and see and gauge what's going on inside that colony. Many books and teachers out there are going to tell you you must go into your hive every week or every 2 weeks, and you must apply these chemicals at these times in order for them to survive. And that can work, but bees are very adaptable. They will really deal with most of the things we do to them. And so I try to just leave them alone and let them do their thing the best I can. And I find that it works better for me in my apiary because I don't treat at all. And so when I first started out in this, I bought 20 packages of bees, which is basically this box. It looks like a shoebox with screen on 2 sides of it. And it's got about 10,000 bees inside. And that's how many Americans start their colonies. And so they'll be shipped up from the southern US. They'll dump this box of bees into their hive, and they'll stick the queen inside, and then they'll let them start doing their thing, building combs. And so when I started out, I started 20 of those, and I lost half of them that first season. Because when you buy bees, just like if you were to purchase other livestock, much of it is medicated. It's treated with various chemicals so that it can combat the mites and other things that these bees deal with. They have many enemies in life as honeybees. And so when you take a creature and cut it off from this thing it's reliant upon, it's not going to be successful. And so over time I've been able to grow my apiary and get to the point where now I have stronger colonies. And so, I had 50% loss that first season, and now I'm consistently at about 10-15% loss. And I'm happy with that. I think a lot of people think that honeybees are like a dog. It's just going to live for 10-15 years happily, but it's a very different creature than a dog. It's a creature that lives usually a few seasons. If you look at feral colonies, they might live a couple seasons, they'll die out, then wax moths will move in. They're like the janitors of a honeybee nest. They'll move in and eat all the wax and clean it out, and then a new colony will find it, and they'll move in and start over again. So while someone may think there's been a honeybee colony living in their tree for 10 years, 20 years, it's probably been many colonies have lived in that tree and just kept reusing that same space. So something that really differentiates my beekeeping from the beekeeping done throughout most of the world, or at least most of the US, is that our hives don't use what's called foundation. That's this stuff here. It's hard to see. It's wax, usually wax, that's been pressed into the shape of hexagons. And so it's wax that's sent in by beekeepers to these manufacturers. They heat it up, they filter it, they press it into that shape, and then they put it in something called a frame. It's like a rectangular frame that holds it in place. And then the bees build their combs off of that. So this is what ours look like. There is no foundation at all. The bees just built their own comb how they wanted to. And so this is called a top bar. And so it's a very different type of beekeeping than what you may see in many of the books out there. The reason they use it is it certainly makes things a little bit easier on a commercial scale. If you are moving your hives, if you are extracting honey from these combs using large machines, having that wire and that uniform shape is really going to make things easier. But for me, as a backyard beekeeper, I don't have a large extracting machine. I don't move my bees very often. And so I really let them do their thing and stay where they are happily and build their combs the way they want to. And so that is why I started using foundationless hives, as they're called. Other reasons for it are that they don't prefer it. If you give bees the option, if you put in some foundation and then you put in some frames without foundation, they almost always build out the frames without the foundation first. And it's like they prefer to do it their own way. Because if you look at a feral colony, there's going to be diverse cell size. The cells could range from 4.9 millimeters up to 6 millimeters, depending on what the bee is going to do with those cells. And so I like to let them choose the size and do the thing the way they want to do. And I have a few other reasons up there as well, including when you buy foundation, when it's on the store shelf and looking nice and fresh. Marianne Fraser at Penn State has done a number of studies on it and found dozens of chemicals, and that's miticides and pesticides, some of them applied by the beekeepers themselves, and also because the bees are foraging out for miles away from their hive, and they don't know what they're foraging on or what chemicals they're picking up, and a lot of people spray stuff on their weeds, and bees love weeds, and so they'll go back to their hive with these chemicals and drop them off in that hive, and that ends up in that foundation that you purchase. So I talked a little bit about some of this. It's not going to have those chemicals to start. Certainly as the colonies forage and bring that stuff back, it's going to get it, which we'll cover a little bit later here. Honey harvest can be very simple. You don't need all the extra stuff to harvest honey, and you don't need to buy foundation anymore. Now, foundation is very expensive. It's also very tedious to get into that frame. And so by letting them do it themselves, basically we give them a bar, an empty bar, I'll bring it over to the camera for you, with nothing on it. It just has this guide here from which the bees build their own comb. If you didn't have this guide, they would build their combs all over the place, diagonal and in every way you can imagine, because they don't care if you can get into their hive. They never ask you, and they don't really care about you at all, unless you're there bothering them and killing their friends, and then they really care. And so we take advantage of the fact that honeybees usually build nice straight combs if they have a guide. So my first hives had a popsicle stick, or 2 popsicle sticks. I just glued them right down a little kerf I'd cut out, and I flip it over, put it inside, and they usually build straight combs. But I say usually because nothing is always perfect in beekeeping. Bees sometimes ignore all your guides and go just right across them anyway, even though their friends right next door are doing it perfectly. And so you'll encounter that if you become a beekeeper. The bees, again, never ask you first. So this one over here is called a horizontal top bar hive. This is technically it's a Kenyan top bar hive. It's a long hive and it has sloped sides, as you may be able to see in the image up there. Certainly at the end, if you can't see in the back, you can come up and look at it. It's got a roof that hinges. You don't have to have that. A lot of people are building these hives themselves, and that's why they're becoming so popular. Is you don't need a lot of fancy tools to make them. They don't require that fancy frame to keep it. Really, you just need these sticks laying across the box, and the bees are going to build their combs. And so the original top bar hive, they believe, would have been in ancient Greece. They have some examples of these pot-like hives, and it had a few sticks laid across a pot, and the bees would live in there just the same way. So this is a much fancier version. So there's many plans out on the internet, so you could build your own. Some people just buy bars from us because those things are no fun to make, and then they'll just build their hive based on that bar dimension. Some advantages of this type of hive are that they're going to build their own combs. You can put a window in it so you can look in and see what's going on without really getting into the hive and getting stung. Honeybees tend to be docile, but they can also be aggressive. You never know with honeybees. Most of the time they're very docile and they don't bother you at all as long as you're not dropping their combs or smashing their friends. But every once in a while you'll get what's called a hot colony, and that's a colony that is more aggressive. You know, you walk near the hive and they start pelting you in the forehead. And then if you still don't go away, they might, take more drastic action, like sting you. But honeybees don't want to sting you because they die when they sting human flesh or anything that's soft. But many people don't realize that honeybees, when they sting an insect, when they sting through an exoskeleton, they don't die. Their stinger does not come off. So they're kind of on a level playing field with yellow jackets and wasps. But if they were to sting a mammal, they will die. So cool things about this are that it's at a nice height. If you were to build your own, and if you don't have a fancy stand like this, you could just put it on cinder blocks or something to elevate it. This is going to help you so you don't have to bend over. Many beekeepers are moving to these type of hives because they have bad backs. From bending over all day, lifting up 80-pound boxes. The more commercial hive, those white boxes you saw out in those fields, their boxes can weigh upwards of 80 pounds. And it makes it nice because you don't need as many boxes, but they're incredibly heavy. And so with this, the heaviest thing I need to lift is a comb like the one I showed you over there, hanging from a bar. And that comb might weigh 7 pounds if it's full of honey. But that's far easier than a box full of combs. And so when I'm going through this hive, I'm not exposing as many bees either, because if I were to inspect this comb, and when you ask questions I can cover more details on how to inspect, but as I inspect the combs and I set them down, I'm really only exposing a couple combs at a time. With any hive that's a stack of boxes, as soon as you remove that roof, there's maybe 8 or 10 combs of bees staring at you, wondering why you're there. And they tend to be far more aggressive in this style and then the bigger white box Langstroth style. So as I go through the hive, I'm not exposing so much. With this style hive, I tend to start the bees at one end. And I'll talk about getting bees. I'll show you the video of catching a swarm, because that is my preferred method of acquiring honeybees. Feral swarms. If I know they came out of someone's wall or out of a tree or something, I'm very eager to get those bees because they've been living without the medication or intervention from humans for at least a season, if they're swarming out of a wall like that. And so when I catch those, I dump them in at one end. I usually leave them about 10 bars of space. So there's 2 what are called dividers or follower boards inside this long box. And these allow me to give the bees a bit of space at a time. So I can expand and contract the amount of space depending on how strong the colony is. So I would basically space these 10 bars apart. I pull the bars out, I dump my bees in, and then they're going to be all crawling around wondering what's going on. And then I put all my bars in, carefully, try not to smash any bees. Because every time you kill a bee, it releases a pheromone, smell, to tell the other bees that we're dying, and this is no good. And so it works the same way. When they sting something, it's like a homing beacon. And so if you were to get stung in the hand, the stinger is going to be there pumping away, but it's also releasing this smell. And it's a smell that smells like bananas. So if you're in a hive and you smell bananas, you are doing it wrong. And that's a warning. It's telling all the other bees to attack this person. And so as soon as you smell that, usually they all kind of unite and come after you. So as long as you don't smell that and they're not chasing you or anything, you're good. And just continue carefully moving through the hive and doing whatever it is you're doing. So I start them out with about 10 bars. And as they move through this box, I keep moving this divider down and giving them more bars of space. And that's the key. One of the key aspects of beekeeping is giving them enough room. Honeybees can have very massive colonies. If they're living in a wall or a tree or something, they could have combs that are 6 feet tall, and they could weigh a lot. And so in this style hive, it's a fixed cavity. It's only 42 inches long. It doesn't get any bigger. And so you must be careful about giving them enough room in this box. And if you don't, they're going to start swarming. Swarming is the way honeybees reproduce. It's how they make more colonies. And so, other creatures mate and give birth. Honeybee colonies split in half. They take their old queen with them, and they raise a bunch of new virgin queens at this time. And so they'll take their old queen with them. They'll fly and land on a branch, like many of you have seen. And then the scouts, these are the bees who are the oldest in that clump. They're going to fly around the area looking for a new cavity to live in. And they're going to come back. They're going to dance and tell the other bees that we found this awesome spot. Just like the bees that found, the bee that I fed and that told her friends. It works the same way when they're finding a new cavity. So they'll come back, dance, tell the other scouts that this place is great. And if you're looking at one of those big clumps that's hanging there, you can see them dancing on the outside of it. And the other bees will be watching. And the more bees that are dancing, and the more vigorously they dance, the more likely it is they're going to move to that particular cavity. And so it's basically a popularity contest. And so once they're all doing the same dance, they will all take off. And they could fly for a mile or two away from where they're hanging and then move into a wall or a tree or whatever it is they found to be a good space to live in. And so that will happen if you don't give them enough room. They're going to feel like this is inadequate. We must split in half to keep reducing our numbers. Otherwise, they won't have enough honey stores, to get through winter. Because their whole purpose in life as honeybees is to store up enough food for that next winter and then do it again. And if there's not enough food, they will starve and they've failed. We can talk certainly more about top bar hives in a bit. I did want to show you a couple images of combs. This is a comb with what's called brood inside. Brood is where the baby bees are developing. And so this bottom 2/3 or so is full of bees that are in their pupa stage of life, and soon they're going to hatch. You can see these cells that are empty. That means bees have hatched recently. And if you're holding up a comb, this one has no brood in it, but this darker part here did have brood in it at one point. They will repurpose combs throughout the season. So at one point this may have been full of baby bees, and now it's full of mostly honey up at the top here. And so if you're holding up a comb going through your hive, you're going to see bees hatching. As they come out of their cell, they're going to look wet and small, and that's because their exoskeleton is not hardened fully yet. But from the time they hatch, they begin working. You'll see them cleaning out the cells next to them, and they're going to go on through a number of jobs in that hive throughout their life until the last week of their life. And their life during the bee season is about a month. That last week of their life is where they actually forage. And that's when, if you're in your garden and you see a honeybee on your flowers, she's not going to live much longer. And it's because they work so hard throughout that season, their body just can't keep up. And also at the top of this comb here, there's honey. You can see it's kind of a whiter color up at the top, and they tend to keep a band of honey across the top of each comb. And that's likely so they have food sources right there as they're feeding their young. The young bees do eat a lot. This is another image of brood. And down here you can see bees hanging, and that's called festooning. And that's where they're basically like gauging or measuring where they're going to build next. So if you were to dump 10, 20,000 bees into a box and then hold up one of those bars, you'll see bees in this giant chain hanging there. And then the next day you might see a comb there where that chain was. This is a picture of a warrior hive. That one has windows on it. We offer windows on all our hives just because we think they're neat. It makes it easy to see what's going on in your hive without disturbing them too much. I was telling someone earlier, up until the late 1800s, most hives had windows. And then they went to the wayside and hives became very boring. So this is a warrior hive. It was developed by some monk in France in the early 1900s. His idea was that it was a very simple hive to build. He was very pragmatic in his approach to beekeeping. He wanted a hive that he didn't have to go into very often. So in the strictest sense, he'd go in like twice a year. In the spring, he'd add boxes. And he had minions to do this, so I recommend all of you get some minions to do all the work for you. So he'd add boxes in the spring to the bottom, and then in the fall he would harvest from the top. And we can go into that during questions. But inside each of these boxes are little bars, just like those, but there's 8 bars in each box with space between them. And so the bees are going to build 8 combs per box, and they're going to build from the top box down. And so if you saw those white boxes earlier, they tend to add boxes on top and harvest from the top. This one, Warren wanted to try and mimic a tree cavity or a natural cavity that bees would choose to live in. And if they move into a tree, there's no boxes or bars. There's just a big hole. And so they start at the top of that and they build downward until they run out of space. And so he took advantage of that. So you add to the bottom, you harvest from the top, and really you leave it alone as much as you can. And so for new beekeepers, it can be kind of intimidating because it's harder to get into and pull combs out. So since it's so much more hands-off, you really have no idea what's going on a lot of the time. And so I get a lot of people calling me wondering what's happening in their hive, and I try and explain to them. But there's a good number of books out there. I'll have a list of resources at the end here that are going to cover a lot of those things, a lot of the signs that you can see on the outside of the hive without disturbing them. This is a blown-out view of the warrior hive. There's a roof, Under that, there's a little box called the Quilt Box, and in there you'd put sawdust or cedar shavings, or something that absorbs moisture. Below that, he's got a couple boxes and the floor. And so it's also another hive that's pretty simple to build. If you're handy at all, and I'm sure some of you are, there are plans out there on the internet to build these hives. Some awesome French guy did this. He made a plexiglass II Hive. And so he wanted to show what it looks like inside the colony. And so you can see they've built out these ones fully. And down here, where all these bees are clustered, they're building out more combs. So they're continuing to build downward through that hive. On the right, that's an image from one of our customers, just showing how straight the combs are. A lot of people, especially people that come from the more traditional background with that foundation, they never think that bees would build straight combs. And so I like to show them that they can indeed build straight combs. Harvest from either of these hives can be easy. And you could take one of these. If this was full of honey from top to bottom, I would harvest it. And so I usually would use a bee brush. So it's exactly that, it's a brush. And you brush the bees off each side until they're all off of the comb. And then I would cut the comb off, and then you could just cut it into squares. And I think I might have an image of that. Yeah. So you could just cut it into squares and eat it as cut comb honey. Or you could crush it and strain it. If you have mason jars, I bet a few of you have some mason jars, and cheesecloth, you can take the comb and cut it into chunks, put it in the jars and smash it with a spoon, and then put cheesecloth over it and upturn it over another jar and just use gravity. And that way you don't need an extractor or anything expensive. You probably got it all in your kitchen somewhere. And so on a small scale, that works really well. On a larger scale, since I got a lot more hives, I'll use bucket strainers. It's the same idea. I'll have one bucket with holes in the bottom and a paint strainer bag in the top. And I'll throw in 30 pounds, 50 pounds of honey, smash it, and then let it drain down into the bucket below. And then I have a honey gate on that bucket, and then I fill up jars. And so it's pretty simple. This is an image of our store. Our store is over on Hawthorne, about 18th, right behind Castagna Cafe, if any of you are familiar with that. So we have pretty much everything you might need to get started in backyard beekeeping. And then I have a list of resources here. I can send this to you if you want, this list. You could always just email me. At the end here, I'll have some business cards, so you have my email address. But now I'm ready for any questions you might have after that very, very brief introduction to beekeeping. Any questions? Yes?
Like when you showed the plexiglass version of this,
Yes?
does that bother the bees? Like, does it matter to them that it's completely see-through?
Right. Honeybees tend to work in total darkness. A lot of people don't think about this, but if they're living inside a tree, it's pitch black dark in there. So they are used to working by touch and smell, but they can't see. So like with this hive, if I were to open that window, they all will fly into the plexiglass wondering what just happened. And so that hive there that had the plexiglass sides, I'm pretty sure he had another outer shell around it to keep it dark inside. And then he would just take that off to show people, because they don't seem to like when a bunch of light is shining into their hive. Yeah?
What are some of the plants that we can plant that attract bees?
Blackberries. And I bet you don't have to plant those. Blackberries that's the main nectar flow in the Pacific Northwest. I believe Oregon is the largest producer of blackberries in the country, and that's where the vast majority of the honey is going to come from in your hive. So if there's any blackberries nearby, that's going to be great. Clovers are awesome. Honeybees are different than most other bee species in that they go after one type of flower at a time. So when they go out to forage, they tend to target, if they're going after clover that trip, they won't go to anything else. So if there's a bunch of clover next to something else, they're going to ignore it and just go after the clover, go back, drop off the nectar or pollen or whatever they're gathering, and then they might go out for something else. Bumblebees will just forage around indiscriminately and gather from whatever they find. And so honeybees like a great swath of one type of flower. So if you can throw out a cover crop or something, if you have a lawn, maybe throw clover out into it, or weeds. Maybe leave your dandelions. If they start growing in the spring, don't cut them, because that's a really good pollen source for bees early on in the spring, and they need that to raise their young. But there's Xerxes Society, if any of you have heard of them. Their website has a lot of native plants that are good for all pollinators, not just honeybees, all the native bumblebees and sweat bees and things. And so that would be a good resource to look at. And in the far back behind, yes?
Okay. How much space do you need to have? Okay. Quick question for those of us who live in kind of your traditional neighborhood.
Right.
How much space do you need to have around your box?
You really only need enough space for the hive, because the bees aren't really going to be bothering you or your yard, and they're probably not even going to be foraging much in your yard. I have a lot of customers that, they spend years planting their garden and planting these beautiful plants, and then they watch as their bees just fly right over them and go to the neighbor's yard full of weeds. So you don't need a lot. There's a lot of people in New York City keeping bees on their rooftops, on their balconies. In Paris, France, there are bees on top of the Opera House. So bees are going to forage out for miles. So as long as you've got enough space to put the box, this one certainly takes up less room than the long one over here. That's all you really need. Now, it's nice if you have enough space where it can be out of the way and not be scaring your neighbors or your family, because people still don't know what it is. You saw my hives in my yard. My neighbors, and I've got a bunch of them right there, for the longest time I didn't have a fence, and they didn't know what the hives were because they don't look like normal beehives. And it wasn't until I was out there in a bee suit with a smoker that they finally asked, oh wow, those are beehives. And they had 500,000 bees right next to them and they didn't know it. So people are pretty oblivious to what's going on around them. I do recommend having enough space to get behind the hive, because you tend to work the hive from behind. Because if you're standing, like this hive has an entrance right here. So you want to face the entrance, ideally southeast. There's a whole checklist out there of placement thoughts. And so southeastern exposure, early morning sun, these are all things we consider when we're placing a beehive. So if you can get behind it and lift the hive and do whatever it is you need to do, and you don't have to climb over things to get there, that's helpful. And if you are going to put it on a roof, you should really consider that, because I've had people do that and then they regret it later. Because once you place a hive, it's hard to move it. Because if you move your hive, over a couple feet away from where you'd originally placed it, say if I had a hive here and I move it at the other side of the room, the bees didn't get the memo. They're going to fly right back to where the hive was and die in a big pile. Because they don't know their hive moved. They're just going to go right out of their hive and forage, and they don't take note. So you need to move it in stages, or you need to move it a couple miles away and leave it for a week, and then bring it back. And then they'll usually take better note of what's going on. Any other questions? Yes?
So you're talking about importing bees. So if I put some things in my yard, is there a worry about them outcompeting the natives? And that would be an issue for me.
I think it would be, honeybees are not native to North America. They were brought over probably in the 1600s sometime. And so who knows what native bees have gone to the wayside because of honeybees. Honeybees are the most advanced of the bee species socially. They live in the biggest colonies. Their colony could be 50, 60,000 bees. Bumblebees might have a colony of 50 bees. And they don't dance and do all the fancy stuff that honeybees do. And so honeybees are really, when they arrived in North America, the Native Americans called them white man's fly. And the bees were migrating across North America quicker than the white man. And so when they'd see them in the trees, moving in to their area, they'd know that, us white guys are right behind. And so it's tough to say. There's going to be, if you're in the Portland metro area, there's going to be so many honeybee colonies already. I don't know that one more is going to make that much of a difference, especially when they're foraging so far. Like mason bees are a great example of a really good bee for people that are starting out and don't necessarily want to commit to honeybees, because mason bees don't sting. Mason bees also don't forage very far. So if you put them in your yard, they're those blocks with holes in them or tubes, they'll usually stay in your yard and forage on all of your flowers and help your crops. Honeybees are going to do that too, but more of them are going to be foraging out away from your house to find the weeds I was talking about. So I wouldn't be too worried about it. I'd be more worried if you're in a rural area, because in the city there's so many more flowers, there's so much more diversity, and so the bees in the city actually tend to do better than bees out in more rural areas. All my early colonies were out in wine country, and that was cool to say my bees are in wineries, but bees don't forage on wine grapes. And so that didn't work very well. And there's not as many flowers out there. Just like the almonds, most of the flowers were torn out to put grapes. And so that is where you might run into issues with them not having enough food to get through the winter, if that sort of helps answer any of your questions.
Well, I see native bees in my yard. I know they're there. So I wouldn't want to do this if I was going to disrupt what's obviously a positive thing right now. So.
It also depends on the type of flowers. There's some flowers that honeybees will forage on, but bumblebees or other bees won't, because maybe their tongues aren't long enough. And so there's certain clovers out there that bumblebees can forage on happily, but the honeybees can't. So they tend to have their own little niches. Yes?
So does this kind like lift off and how do you, okay.
The roof sets over it. Below that is that quilt box thing I was talking about. You'd put sawdust or something in here that absorbs. A lot of beekeepers in the Pacific Northwest are trying these out because it's so wet here, they think it might help. The original, that white box hive I showed you, the Langstroth hive, it had one of these, and then it went away for some reason.
So why do you need that? I mean, this doesn't have anything now with this, right?
Correct.
To the-
I mean, you don't have to have it. I use it just because Rory told me to. But I find it works well.
It just helps keep moisture out, is that it?
That's the idea, that it's going to wick away moisture as it absorbs it. This burlap is really exposed to the outside. It's hanging under this roof, and the roof's really just a cover, keeping the water out. Below that is another piece. Everyone wonders what this piece of burlap is for. And it's because bees glue everything in their hive down with propolis, which is this red stuff. And so this is tree resin that they gather. So they're going to be flying around looking for resin. They're going to gather it on their legs, just like pollen. And you'll see the bees landing with it. It looks like this shiny red stuff. And then they use it throughout their hive to seal it. It's used in naturopathic remedies. It's antiseptic. So often creatures will die inside the hive that are too large for the bees to carry out. So say they kill a mouse inside their hive. They can't lift a whole mouse, but they can entomb it in propolis. And so I've seen many pictures of mice, that have been totally covered in propolis and mummified, and that way they don't rot, and the bees can live in a nice, clean hive. They're very clean creatures. They don't go to the bathroom in their own hive if they can avoid it. So in the winter, if it's cold like it is now, they're all holding it, waiting. And the next time it's sunny, you'll see them all going out and going on what are called cleansing flights. And that's where they go to the bathroom all over the place. And so people that have a clothesline have run into the issue where they have their clothesline out. It's really idyllic looking. They got their beehive and their clothesline, and all their clothes are covered in yellow dots because that's bee poop. And it's the same thing. In the spring, summer, I'm usually covered in yellow dots. It happens. So yes, back to what I was saying. There's this piece here that it allows you to peel this off, because otherwise the bees will glue this box down with propolis, and you have to chisel the thing off. It's very strong stuff. And they'll also glue the boxes together. So I forgot to bring one, but we have a tool. It's basically like a pry bar to reach in and pry the boxes apart. They'll do the same thing with those bars over there. They'll glue them down, and you'll have to pry them apart. Because, again, they don't really want you in their hive. And as I said earlier, there are little bars inside this box. And this is an example of sort of a bit of a comb. And that's actually a popsicle stick, like I was saying earlier.
How do you prevent them from swarming if they do? I got caught in a swarm 2 summers ago.
Mm-hmm.
And I can't remember what the explanation was for it, but is there a way that you manage the hive in some way to actually prevent that from happening? I live right on Hawthorne.
Yep.
And I know when my chickens get out, one of my neighbors tends to ridicule me for it. I could only imagine if there was a swarm of bees happening on Hawthorne.
Yeah. So that is a good question. This question was about, can you prevent swarming? And there are some things you can do to minimize it, but honeybees want to reproduce. Like every other creature, they want to make more of them. And so you can do some things to try and stop it. You can, like I said earlier, you can give them more space. And there's some more advanced things, which this book over here talks about, and I don't think I can go into today. But there's a lot of little things you can try and do to give them the idea that there's more room in their hive. But eventually, they're going to swarm. At some point, they're going to beat you, and you're going to see your bees flying off into the sunset.
Right.
And it's always fun chasing them. They can scale houses, and you can't, and soon they're gone. But usually when they swarm, they'll go land on a branch, within a tree branch or something that they find suitable, within 20, 30 feet of their hive. And so when I come home, like, my yard, I got a bunch of hives, And so when I come home in the afternoon on a swarmy day, as I call them, and that'll be, swarm season in Portland is usually Easter through June, July. And so I'll come home and I might have 3 swarms hanging there from a couple trees that they like to land on. They almost always land on the same ones. And I don't know why that is, but they tend to choose certain branches. And I'll come out, I'll just look out the window, if I see them, I'll walk out, drop them into a box, and I have another colony. So old-time beekeepers, the guys back in the 1800s that used those woven basket hives, they loved swarms because that's how they increased, that's how they got more colonies. Beekeepers today hate swarms because that reduces their production. When a colony swarms, they stop laying eggs for up to a month. You might have no new bees. And so that is going to reduce your production. And also the bees take a bunch of the honey with them when they go. They need food on their trip because they don't know how long they're going to be out there searching. And so for production, it's not good. But if you have, you can either have one hive producing 200 pounds, or maybe you have 2 hives producing 100 pounds each. I'd rather have more colonies and I'd rather let them do what they want to do. Because I think there are other benefits to swarming. I think it's a natural defense to their biggest enemy, the Varroa mite. It looks almost like a flea. It's this tiny little mite that is really the bane of beekeepers' existence since the 1970s. It came from Asia, and so the European honeybee had no defense against it. And so it lives and develops inside the cell of the young bee as it's going from egg to larva to pupa. And so it's during that pupal stage that the female Varroa mite lays all her eggs, and they hatch and they feed on that bee. And so if there are no eggs for a month, that means there's no Varroa mites for a month. They can't reproduce. And so to me, it's a good thing to let them swarm maybe once a year. But if they're swarming 5 times, it's probably because you failed. You didn't give them enough space. And so, I think there's a lot of argument about swarming and whether it's good or bad. Yes?
If the honey is for the bee survival, what percentage of it do you harvest each winter?
So the first season, you should not expect to harvest anything. Because when you first install your bees, they've got to build up, they've got to build comb, they've got to store nectar, and they've got to ripen it and turn it into honey. Because when they gather it at first, I forgot to talk about this part. When they first gather it, it's this clear, shiny liquid in here. And that's still in nectar form. And so they go through many, many weeks of fanning their wings during the summer, pumping air through the hive and evaporating that water. And they get it to about 80% sugar content, and then they seal it. And it's almost like canning. And so they'll seal it off, and now it will last forever. And so when we go through the hive, we want to make sure that they have at least 30 to 50 pounds of honey in the hive here in Portland for them to survive the winter. And so they might have 100 pounds. If they do, maybe you could harvest half of that and still leave them plenty to get through winter. So it all depends on the colony and how much it's produced. There's other colonies. You might have 2 colonies right next to each other, and one that's got 10 pounds and one that's got 100. And so you could either take some from the strong one and give it to the weak one, or you could let the weak one die and then increase from that strong one next year. And a lot of that just depends on your philosophy and whether you want to keep cropping up colonies that can't do it on their own.
So when you're talking about taking 40 or 50 pounds or something like that, could you take the whole comb and cut it in quarters? So are you just taking every other one or something? I mean, how do you manage that? You can't take all the honey, you have to leave some.
Right.
But
So
your diagram showed that you're cutting up the comb into quarters and crushing it.
yeah, so when I harvest, I take the whole comb. So in this hive, the colony was going to start down here or down there, whichever end you start them at. They're just going to keep building toward the empty space. It works the same way here. They're going to start at the top and build downward, and then they're going to just keep storing their honey at one end. They like to have it all consolidated together. And so at the end of the season, they might have built out this hive all the way. And so I would harvest from down here. And I'd go through and I'd find combs that are sealed off, that are capped, like I showed you. Because if you harvest the ones that are not all capped, if it's all uncapped and still in nectar form, it could ferment, and you've got mead, which is cool, I guess, or explode, or it could go bad. And so you want to harvest the stuff that's done. And so you might need to go in a few combs to find one that's been fully ripened. And so before I harvest, I like to go through most of them to make sure I'm not taking too much. Because there might only be a few back here and then nothing down here for them to eat. And then I've harvested it all and they're stuck. So I tend to leave them far more than they need. And then the next spring, if they've died, then I can harvest. Or if they survive and there's still some left, I can harvest. I think it's important for people to know honeybees can die. You may get into this and have them die. And that's horrible. And so a lot of people start with 2 hives, so it's less demoralizing when they lose one, because they've still got the other. And also because then if, say this colony were to go queenless, and this will happen every once in a while, like if they've swarmed and they've not requeened themselves properly, I can take eggs from another hive and I can give them a comb with eggs in it, give it to my hive that is queenless, and the bees will take those eggs and turn them into queens. They're able to do that by feeding them royal jelly. And it's just a trick you can do if you have 2 hives. If you have 1 hive, you're stuck. You have to buy a queen from someone and get charged a lot of money and fly it in from somewhere, and the bees will probably kill it because they don't know who this queen is. So I like to let them manage it themselves, which is why having 2 hives can really help. Yes?
So they leave a bunch of queen, like larvae or whatever. How did they figure out which one is going to be the queen? Do they fight to the death or something?
So when bees, yes. So the queen, she has a name. It sounds royal and great, but she's really a slave to her workers. The workers are the ones that created her. They came from her eggs, but they're the ones that choose when to make queens. They monitor her progress. They monitor how many eggs she's laying and how healthy she seems. And if they notice her pheromone is starting to subside, because she releases a pheromone everywhere she goes, telling them I'm here and everything's great. And once that starts, getting worse and worse, and once she starts laying less eggs, the workers notice, and they'll start raising new queens. They'll take eggs and they'll feed them royal jelly. They'll create what are called queen cells, and they look like, forgot to bring some, but they look like peanuts sticking out. So if this comb had brood in it, I showed you some pictures of brood, but they stick out, actually kind of go downward. They're much bigger than a worker cell, and that's because a queen is significantly larger than a worker. And so they'll create these queen cells, they'll keep feeding them that royal jelly past day 3. If they feed a female egg, that is a fertilized egg, royal jelly past day 3 of its existence.
So they're like gremlins.
They're like gremlins, yes. It'll start growing sex organs. It'll grow what's called a spermatheca, which is a giant sac that holds sperm, and it'll turn into a queen. And whichever one hatches first tends to kill the others. Queens have a stinger, but it's not barbed. It's just like a knife. And it'll find the competition, and if the workers let her, she'll go and she'll stab through and kill the other queens. Sometimes they may want more queens. They might want to swarm and take one of these new queens with them and keep swarming until they're down to the right population. So the workers manage all of that. Any other questions? Yes?
How did you know your colonies were kind of downsizing by 10 to 15% each year?
Well, I'm saying that they died entirely. So our losses, we call it, are how many colonies you die that winter. And so you'd go out to your hive and you'd have a pile of dead bees and no more living bees inside. And so I just, I do the math. I figure out I lost 10, 15% of them. And then the next spring, the cool thing about bees, unlike cattle or something, is that you can split them. You can turn them into 2. You can't just cut a cow in half and have it survive. So you can take a strong colony and take out some combs that have eggs and honey and all the various stages of things in them and put them in another hive. And if whichever one doesn't have a queen, they're going to take those eggs, like I said earlier, and make a queen of their own. Because otherwise they'll die. Without a queen, they have no chance of success. So you can take a strong colony and split it. This is another way you can minimize swarming. You can basically make them swarm. You choose when they're going to do it. And so that's just a more advanced technique you can do to make more colonies. And I do that usually in June or July. If I've got a bunch of hives and I want to overwinter even more, you saw those little boxes in my backyard. Those were all what are called splits. And so I took a bunch of my strong colonies that I like their genetics, they are producing a lot, they seem healthy, and I just make them into 2. And you could do that 3 times, 4 times in a season and have them continue living. Any other questions? Yeah?
So if I wanted to be a beekeeper, would I just pick up one of those boxes, put honey on it, and then bees would just come?
So, yeah, there's a couple ways to get bees. I told you about packages, those boxes of bees you can buy. There are swarms you can go catch, which I'm going to show you a video here in a second. But another way you can do it is you can lure a swarm of bees to your hive. And to do this, you could use lemongrass oil. The essential oil, you can buy it at any place that has essential oils. And you can put it in your empty box, whatever type, and You don't need anything else inside, just like 2 drops of lemongrass oil and put it out in your yard where you want it to go. And bees may move into your box. And people always say that's crazy, that'll never work, but it works. I have a customer in Lake Oswego, and she caught like 20 swarms this past spring by hanging up little hives all over her neighbors' yards, and it worked great. So there are a lot of feral hives out there that want places to live. And so if you hang up boxes or build hives and put them in your yard, you may have a colony move in. It's not guaranteed, so you may be disappointed if you put 1 box out and wait, and it may be 3 years before they move in. Or I had another customer, it was the next day. He put up his box, next day he looked out and he had bees. So it all depends on how many colonies are nearby and swarming. So let me show this video, and then I think we'll basically be done here. Somewhere. Where did you go, video? So I believe this is a video of a swarm hanging from a persimmon tree. This is now my largest bee yard. I think I've got 18 hives there. And so what often happens when you go out to catch swarms is that the homeowner will decide they want to either be a beekeeper or they want you to put hives in their yard. So if you don't have space in your own yard, there's no lack of people out there that want bees in theirs. So if you live in an apartment and you can't keep bees, talk to your friends and family and maybe they'll let you keep bees there. So I didn't have to wear a bee suit, but you never know with swarms. Most of the time they don't care about you at all. Whatever you drop them into, they're going to think is their new home. But I'd like to be safe. It's no fun getting stung in the forehead and looking like Quasimodo. So that's a banker's box, as I'm sure some of you saw. Those, the counting boxes. It was a convenient size. It fit in my trunk, and I was out of the other boxes that I used. And so I just shook them into the box. I tilted that little lid on there, and now the bees, if the queen has fallen into that box, they're going to start moving in. If she's still up on that branch, they're going to evacuate that box and go right back to the branch. So sometimes you can lay out a sheet or something below it, and that way if you drop the queen on the ground, they don't all go to the ground. Because once they're on the ground, it's no fun, because they don't want to move at that point, they're mad at you, and it's really hard to get them from the ground into a box. But this is really an ideal swarm, because it was at 3 feet off the ground, on a branch that's easy to shake, but sometimes they'll be on a fence, or on a door, or on something that is something you can't shake like this. So at this point, I see they're moving in, they're not leaving the box. It's hard to see in the image, but there were bees fanning their wings and sticking their rear ends in the air, and they're releasing a pheromone to tell the other bees where to go. And so at this point, the homeowner told me, please put a hive in my yard. So I came back with a hive, and now I'm going to drop those bees into the box. And so that's one of these hives. And then I'll put the bars in, gently, trying not to smash them. And
Was there anything in the box first, or it was just a...
It's just one of these empty. There were bars in the bottom box, and the top box had no bars in it, so there was a hole.
Wow. And so, are you like, okay, well, I'm gonna get stung a couple times today, or is it like, no, unless something goes wrong, I'm not gonna get stung at all?
I rarely get stung by swarms. If you had to go into a wall and remove bees, then they are not happy, because they are established, their baby bees are there, their queen is there, all their comb is there, and they will try and kill you. But when they're hanging there on that branch, they don't have a home, they're all full of honey, all they want to do is find a place to live. So if you drop them into something, they'll think that is their home. So if I left them in that banker's box, that night you would have seen combs hanging from the underside of the lid.
How do you put the bars in without smashing?
They move. I mean, the bees will move. They don't like getting smashed. So if you start setting the bars in, you can usually wiggle them from side to side, and the bees will run out of the way. So then I lean that box up against the entrance so that the bees can continue filing their way in.
So you said you smoke them and stuff like that, but is there a lot of other things you have to do to them once you drop them into the box?
With a swarm, no. I didn't smoke that one. Swarms, I never smoke. It's when you're going into an established hive that I smoke them. Smoke, it masks their pheromone, that it doesn't allow them to communicate. Some people also think it might make them think their hive is on fire, and maybe they'll ignore you and start gathering honey to take off. I don't know why it works, but it definitely works. If you have an aggressive colony and you give it a couple puffs of smoke, you don't need to put flames in there, or it doesn't take a lot. It's a lot less than you'd think, and it'll totally change the demeanor of the bees.
Yep.
Does anybody have like bumblebee honey?
Not really. There's a stingless bee in South America and Australia, I think, that it produces like little honey pots, as they're called, and they'll harvest from those, but it's very little compared to honeybees. Bumblebees do live in colonies, and they look like little mounds. It's like a Martian landscape that the queen bumblebee creates, and then they'll store nectar in honey pots, but they only store enough to live for a couple weeks. Honeybees store enough to live for 6 months. Yep.
If you have like a couple hives and you have like cats and dogs and kids around, is that okay? Or?
Yeah, in the yard, my yard you saw, I've got 2 Australian Shepherds, and they run around the hives, but dogs usually learn quickly about honeybees. They'll run up and smell it and investigate it, get stung in the face, and then they will usually give a wide berth around the hives. And so if their ball goes within a certain radius of the hive, they just stand there and wait for me to get it. So they're not stupid. I've met other dogs that just eat bees. You know, they'll just walk up and keep on eating them, and they're getting stung, and they just keep doing it. So it depends on how smart your dog is. And kids, you know, same thing. They usually learn. I guess I'm done. I'm getting kicked out here.
Well, I encourage you to come up and get cards and talk to Matt some more. Let's give him another round of applause. We can ask him some more questions. And we return on February 5th with Arnon Kardmasov of Bridgetown Forge, and his talk is called The Hand-Forged Chef's Knife, The Japanese Perspective. Bridgetown Forge makes one-of-a-kind pieces using iron forging techniques handed down through the ages, from kitchenware, Japanese-style knives, kitchen and bathroom hardware sculptures, and even throwing spikes. Bridgetown Forge creates forged pieces that you'll pass down for generations to come. And there's more on the website too. Thanks everyone for coming tonight. Yeah, thanks Matt.
Yep.